I am not sure how it happened, but in the past few months, this video has become my most requested ever. And I have absolutely no clue why. I don't think I have teased it in any way, and I assumed it was just a trend that would blow over. But it hasn't. Then I put it up for a patron vote. And of course, it won. So, finally, here I am, with my take on a perfect Italy scenario. And let me start right off by explaining why I have taken so long. Why is it so difficult to create a realistic, perfect Italy? To start off, Italy was just never really that strong. While we instinctively count them as amongst the great powers of Europe, they really aren't deserving of such a title. Sporting a rather pathetic industry, Belgium having almost 3 times the output of Italy, and if we're being honest, Italy doesn't deserve to be counted as a great power, but amongst the middling powers. As a Russian diplomat at the time nicely put it, Italy was merely a great power by courtesy, not by military or economic might. The reasons for this are numerous, and very much not easily resolved, including an outdated, autocratic regime, an oligarchy and aristocracy dominating the state, a failure to effectively integrate the South, leaving the region in the hands of criminals as the economy stagnated, with an outdated military marred by issues, with nepotism running rampant across the institution. Again, these are all pretty fundamental issues to Italy that I cannot easily solve by just waving a magic wand around, assuming I want the scenario to be moderately realistic. But it gets even worse. Italy's diplomatic situation is also horrible, and any expansion of Italy into the territories we know they might want is sure to upset France, or Austria-Hungary, or Russia, and directly or indirectly a lot of the other European powers too. This makes it extremely difficult to craft a realistic scenario where Italy ends up with everything they might want, without also ending up extremely diplomatically isolated. While this might be less of an issue for, say, Germany, which has the industrial and military might to stand by themselves after a victory, Italy does not have this luxury. If Italy ends this scenario isolated, it will learn the meaning of friendship the hard way. It is this inherent Italian weakness, combined with a rough diplomatic situation, that complicates this scenario so much. For this reason, we're doing 2 variations of this scenario. In the first, we will have Italy focus on relations with the Central Powers, trying to ensure good ties with Germany, leading their main goals to be focused against France in the West and against Russian influence in the East. In the second scenario, we will follow the more historical route, where Italy focuses on working with the Entente, finding itself allied to France, Britain and Russia, and as such, their focus will lay on expansion towards the East. Now finally, before we dive in, I will start both of these scenarios shortly after Italy's founding as a nation. This is for a simple reason. First, this video isn't called Perfect Sardinia Piedmont, but more importantly, the further back we go, the less coherent and realistic this scenario becomes, and the more it just becomes map painting. I think this series is significantly more interesting if we stick closer to our own history at the core. But before we split the timeline, there is a lot which we can achieve which applies to both scenarios. The first will just be a general buff to Italy's economy and military. I don't often like to delve too deeply into politics in these perfect videos, as everyone has their own ideas as to what Italy's perfect politics would have looked like. So, I generally prefer to roughly keep what the nation had historically. But it would really help if Italy fixes a number of things to get them on the right track. For example, it would be really nice for their military to just be a bit more meritocratic. And I hardly think that don't have inexperienced nobles dominate your military would be all too radical. I don't intend to make Italy some sort of military powerhouse, but not being the total worst would be pretty nice. Economically, we have the same story. Italy has a lot of fundamental issues which I won't be tackling today, and we won't give Italy a top-class industry. But with minor, behind-the-scenes changes, Italy could at least be closer to industries like Belgium and Austria-Hungary. Again, we won't focus much on this, but just keep in mind that the Italy in this video is just moderately more powerful in these aspects. Now we can finally truly get started with the Austro-Prussian War, during which Italy intervened and sought to overrun the Austrian south. This war became a total embarrassment. Upon their initial invasion, Italy, while outnumbering Austria, got decisively beaten at the Battle of Custoza, and Austria almost caused the destruction of most of the Italian army invading Lombardia, only refraining from doing so because they feared French intervention. The only reason Italy ended up with anything at all at the peace conference is that Prussia decisively defeated Austria, and France and Prussia pressured Austria into handing over Venice. Why did Italy perform this poorly? How could they fail against an Austria so distracted elsewhere? Well, it came down to two factors. First, incompetence and nepotism, with the king often interfering with his generals, and the general in charge having been the prime minister of the nation, joining the army exactly a day before the war began. From there, poor decisions were consistently made, and there were often conflicts over who was actually in charge of the operations. The second issue was that Italy had only unified a few years ago, and the former kingdom of the two Sicilies struggled greatly with this integration. The northern and southern armies and navies often struggled to cooperate. The best example of this is the Battle of Lissa, in which the Italian navy outnumbered the Austrians, yet lost the engagement, failing to secure naval dominance and being heavily humiliated. Now, we could go extreme here. Let Italy smash through the Austrian lines, perhaps even launch an invasion of Dalmatia as Prussia suggested, but we won't. It is absolutely fine if Italy somewhat struggles during this war. Those struggles then hopefully contribute to some military reforms down the line. Italy does not need to reach Vienna, but just by changing a few battles could have at least shown a solid enough performance that they can demand slightly more. If Italy had just won the Battle of Custoza, a battle in which they had almost twice the forces of Austria, they'd have started the war on the right foot. Considering this war only lasted a few weeks, as Prussia was rolling over Austria, that could have been all Italy needed to achieve a solid position when negotiations began. In the peace deal then, Italy obviously gains Venice, just like they did in our timeline. To this, I would like to add them gaining the Italian parts of South Tyrol, greatly improving their position against Austria, having now liberated most Italians within the Austrian Empire. It might have been possible to have Italy win even harder, perhaps gaining parts of Istria or even Dalmatia if successful, yet I think such a policy could only backfire for Italy. An outcome like this destroys Austrian sea access and will ensure that they seek the destruction of Italy, thereby likely ruining Italian relations with Germany in the long term too. This would leave Italy no other choice than to become hopelessly reliant on the French, while Italian expansionism could spook Russia and Britain too. The minor addition of the Italian portions of Tyrol both remove an emotional reason for Italy to seek war with Austria, as most Italians have now been liberated, without humiliating Austria so much that they necessarily have to seek revenge. Now, following this treaty, you might expect me to say that in the upcoming Franco-Prussian War, Italy likewise joins, in an attempt to regain territories recently lost to the French, as well as Corsica and the French-protected Papal State. But I will not do such a thing. There are a couple of reasons for this. Italy unified barely a decade ago, and its armies and navies just weren't ready for such a thing, as the war with Austria had proven. Beyond that, it would be a major betrayal, as Napoleon III had helped Sardinia-Piedmont in the wars that led to Italian independence and unification. Justifying a war against Austria, Italy's oppressor, was easy. Justifying a war against the nation that helped you unify, even if they had held a couple of territories you might like to conquer, would be far more difficult. Germany also didn't really want Italy to join, partially because of their prior military record, but also because the war as it stood was the mean French emperor attacking Germany. if Germany started inviting other nations to partake in a larger partition of France, the other great powers might get involved sooner, to prevent such German-Italian expansionism. Finally, had Italy done such a thing, they would get into this really uncomfortable position where both of their great power neighbors would really want to kill them. If Germany is then pressed to choose, they are not likely to risk it all on Italy, and Italy could very well get a swift demonstration as to why rampant expansionism wasn't a smart idea in the Victorian era. For Italy's sake, they are better off biding their time, taking the free conquest of Rome, and continue their state building, as we now dive into Italy's colonial ambitions. I am sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. You won't be surprised to learn that, as with most things, colonially, Italy was an embarrassment. While most of Africa was being filled out, most of the great powers ended up with major empires. Italy held Somalia and Eritrea, both very minor colonies, their only relevance being proximity to the Red Sea. Then, in 1912, Italy also gained Libya, which, except for the discovery of oil, which they didn't yet know about, was likewise not necessarily a huge pickup. Surely, Italy can do better. So, what did they want from the scramble of Africa? Well, besides generally whatever they could get, Italy had a specific focus on the Horn of Africa region, and perhaps more importantly, the regions of Libya and Tunis right across the sea. These final two areas are most important as they weren't going to be just colonies, but eventually inherent parts of Italy, in the same way that Milan or Naples was. Now, the Italian claims on Tunis we will cover later, because as we will explore, whether or not Italy ends up with that territory could determine the future of their diplomacy. So let's instead start with Libya, which in our timeline was seized during an Italian invasion in 1912. Back in 1878, the Ottomans had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Russia. Yet, fearing the rapid rise of Russia in the Balkans, the great powers had met up to discuss the fate of the region. During this, the gains that Bulgaria made were heavily reduced, but also Britain seized Cyprus, giving France permission to grab Tunis to compensate. The Italian diplomat hinted that they weren't okay with this, so Britain and France informally consented that Italy could gain Libya as compensation. Yet, Italy would wait all the way until 1911 to actually act on this and launch the invasion. An invasion that, of course, was way costlier than it had to be. By the end, Italy had not just gained Libya, but some Greek islands as well. Yet, this war was totally unnecessary. Egypt was officially a part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice had not just become independent, but dominated by Britain. The Ottomans very much realized that defending Libya was near impossible. So, when Italy threatened war, the Ottomans essentially agreed to just hand the territory over to Italy. They only asked that, much like how Egypt was still officially Ottoman, Libya would be too. Italy could have just accepted this and basically gained all they wanted without a war. But nationalist fervor called for blood. There are two alternate strategies I suggest Italy follow regarding Libya. Either strike even earlier, or if you decide to wait, then just simply accept the territory for free rather than fight over it. Either way, for the most part, the conquest of Libya shouldn't upset anyone all too much. This moves us over to Ethiopia. Once more, this was a territory that Italy could have easily wrestled control over with very little consequences. At worst, Britain might feel a little bit sad about it. Italy and Ethiopia had signed a treaty in our timeline, which, according to Italy, turned Ethiopia into their protectorate. Ethiopia disagreed, and so Italy sought to enforce their claim via war. A war that, by all accounts, Italy should have been able to win, having the vastly superior technology. Yet, greatly underestimating the Ethiopians, combined with classic Italian incompetence, ensured their loss, and Ethiopia would continue on as an independent state. Had Italy simply had a more competent army and prepared their invasion better, this war could have been a sweep for the Italians. As a result, Ethiopia is first turned into a protectorate and could then become a more direct colony over time. That about concludes the scramble for Africa. Let's now move on to Asia, where Italy fumbled so hard that they ended up with absolutely nothing. Now, don't get me wrong, Italy was never in the running for any significant colonies in this area, or some huge Pacific empire. Italy had neither the political nor economic willpower for such things, and besides, it really wasn't worth competing with France, Britain and Germany over. These regions just didn't mean that much to Italy. But there are a few moves that Italy can make. First, Denmark used to have these islands and Italy wanted to buy them. This failed in our timeline because Italy's government fell during these talks, but it could easily have been successful. Now in itself, this is a very minor colony, which Italy will very likely at some point sell over to Britain. But this minor purchase might still help Italy be more open to other opportunities in Asia. Most importantly, Sabah. In 1880, the area was offered to Italy, their only main chance for a significant Asian colony. Yet, Britain would pressure Italy into rejecting the sale, and once more, this really is not a territory worth upsetting Britain over. Still, what Italy might do is leverage the threat of buying the territory in order to get Britain to back down over something else. Perhaps Tunis? Finally, Italy in our timeline tried to get a concession in China, like all the other hip European powers. Yet, they were the only nation which tried and failed. The Qing responding to Italy's threat with the devastating, "Italy is not so important in China to allow it to be given treatment like other powers." Ouch. Once more, this is an example of Italy being a great power by courtesy only, not merit. But Italy being successful here wouldn't be all that radical. They did have Britain's diplomatic support, yet no real presence in Asia, very little significant contact with China, and their diplomatic strategy amounted to parking 2 ships outside of China's coast and hoping that China just gave up. They of course did not. It has been estimated by British diplomats at the time that if Italy only waited and then cited the death of some missionary or diplomat to back up their claim, potentially, while being in Asia in greater force, the Qing could have been made to concede. It is not unthinkable that our more powerful Italy, with at least an indirect greater interest in Asia, gets this done. And Italy has their own modest little sphere in China, cementing that Italy does deserve their title of great power. With that, we finally have the part where we split the timeline between a pro-German or a pro-France Italy, and it all revolves around Tunis. Forget all of the other colonies we've discussed. If there is one colony that Italy really wants, it is Tunis. Immediately after unification, Italy sought to cement their ties to the nation, signing a treaty with Tunis, making them economically dependent on Italy. For Italy, this was step 1 in ensuring Tunis remained in their sphere. For Tunis, this was a move to prevent the Ottomans from solidifying their control, as officially, Tunis was still a part of the Turkish Empire. But Italy made a crucial mistake. Their governments were very hands-off in colonial matters, partially shaped by Italy's own experience being dominated by outside powers. Prime ministers of the time preferred a policy of clean hands, arguing that Italy had no right to dominate others by force. A very commendable stance, of course. Beyond that, they considered direct intervention unnecessary. They considered Tunis part of their sphere already, and they thought that nothing would be able to change that. There were 3 main reasons for this belief. First, they assumed that Britain's rivalry with France would ensure British intervention if France did take Tunis. Second, Italy believed that Germany would defend Italy's interests in Tunis. Third, Italy simply believed that the other great powers, seeing Italy's respectful treatment of Tunis, would recognize Italy's inherent moral right to be the overlords of Tunis. It turned out that Italy was wrong on all 3 of these points. For the first, Italy greatly overestimated the Franco-British rivalry. Other nations, like Germany and Russia, had become far more of a concern to Britain. And if anything, Britain was afraid of one nation, Greece, Italy, dominating both sides of the Strait of Sicily, which could allow them to control Mediterranean shipping. For this reason, Britain actually preferred France to get Tunis. To the second point, Germany's support, Italy just failed at diplomacy. Despite strong Italo-French tensions, Rome attempted to balance good relations with both France and Germany. German Chancellor Bismarck, which sought to ensure that France remained diplomatically isolated, had no use for such an Italy which played both sides. So, in a rather brilliant move, Bismarck supported French actions in Tunis, as he knew that this would drive Italy into Germany's sphere for security reasons. Something he was very correct in, as a year after the French invasion of Tunis, Italy would join the Triple Alliance. The final point, that Italy's morally superior claim would be respected, was obviously just a naive hope from the Italian side. So it happened. France invaded Tunis, and Italy was defenseless to stop it, very aware that they could not win a war over it, and they couldn't rely on anyone's support. This loss of Tunis was huge for Italy at the time, as it became a national humiliation, toppling their government. So, if you have followed the story that I just set out, you might have thought of ways for Italy to keep control over Tunis. But pretty much all of them would lead to greatly weakened relations with France and Britain, and put Italy much closer into the German sphere of influence. Thus, this is where the split lays. In one of the scenarios we will discuss today, France still ends up with Tunis, leading to Italian foreign policy closer to our timeline, and one in which Italy manages to consolidate Tunis, and in doing so, exploring a timeline where they decide to stick closer to Germany. Now, securing Tunis for Italy is actually deceptively simple. We would just, in some form, need to remove the peace-minded colonialists ruling Italy at the time. How we do this does not matter, who we replace him with does, with Francesco Crispi being the perfect candidate, sometimes mentioned as the Italian Bismarck or Salisbury, a competent diplomat, but also a strong authoritarian. Crispi, in 1880, realized that in the short term, an alliance with France just wasn't in the cards, arguing to go all in on an alliance with Germany, as well as a preemptive increase in Italy's military position in Tunis. With him in charge, we have a good chance to end up with Italian Tunis. So, Crispi gets to work, making it very clear to Berlin that an Italo-French alliance is not happening, potentially signing an early alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. This would already greatly complicate the matters for France, with the risk of German intervention on the matter, leading to a war which they wouldn't be prepared for at this point. Then, Crispi just has to find any excuse for sending forces to Tunis, whether that be an imagined Ottoman threat, the defense of Italian settlers, fear-mongering over French influence, or anything else. Important is just that with Italian forces present, France has no way to avoid Italy being the defender and getting to call Germany into the war. This should mostly solidify Italy's position, allowing them to slowly reduce Tunis's independence. Of course, this would cause an international crisis, with mostly Britain considering how and if they can intervene. This is where the threat of the sale of Saba might come in, with Italy promising not to do it if Britain cools over Tunis. Other concessions might be Italy agreeing to support British control over Egypt, and almost certainly they will have to promise Britain not to militarize the Tunisian coast and to not interfere with regional shipping. With reluctant British approval and an alliance with Germany, Italy has done it. They have Tunis. So, what might such a Central Powers Italy look like? Well, initially, not all too much changes, as Bismarck and Europe at large had a mostly peaceful foreign policy. But things change as Austria-Hungary becomes more focused on the Balkan, seeking to integrate Bosnia and counteract Russian influence in the region, while Wilhelm II pushes Germany to be more assertive too. Here, the seemingly minor border change between Italy and Austria can become important, as it might ease Italo-Austrian tensions, with Austria being less paranoid about Italian ambitions and the remaining Italian claims on the Austrian Empire being based more on historical or strategic value rather than being Italian majority heartlands. Where this might become crucial is during the weakening of the Ottoman Empire, with most notably interests focusing on Serbia and Albania. Italy has long held designs on Albania, a region historically and geographically close to Italy, which could prove vital in achieving hegemony over the Adriatic. But in 1913, Greece and Serbia were attempting to partition the region between themselves, yet Austria and the Great Powers intervened and forced Serbia and Greece to back off. This alternate timeline might just see Italy support Austria over Bosnia in exchange for Austria supporting Italy in Albania. Italy would not get to directly annex the region, yet they might gain a loose protectorate, officially to defend it from Greece and Serbia. This might cause an international crisis, but by this time, France had informed Russia that they would not follow Russia to war over the Balkans yet, while Britain too wouldn't necessarily be outraged, perhaps welcoming the minor weakening of Russia's position. This, for Austria, can be considered amazing, binding Italy to them in their struggle against Southern Slavic nationalism. When, at some point, obviously assuming we haven't butterflied it away too much, some form of World War I breaks out, Italy's position as ally to Berlin and Vienna is far stronger, weakening Serbia's position, who must fear an attack from behind, while France, likewise, has to be more wary of an Italian attack from the south. That being said, we can still expect Italy to wait a little bit, seeing where the war goes, but once the war seemingly turns in favor of Germany, Italy joins the war too. Don't expect Italy to swiftly overrun southern France. This is a highly defendable border France will have been prepared on. Yet, Italy's participation cracks Serbia, while Bulgaria likewise joins to lock down the Balkans for the Central Powers. Beyond that, in our timeline, the Entente forces fled into neutral Albania and Greece. This might at least partially be prevented here, with either a weakened Entente front in Macedonia, or even just a Central Powers invasion of Greece. Beyond that, on the African theater, Italy opens up a bunch more front lines for the Central Powers. It is here where I think we need to recognize the difference between our alternate Italy joining the Central Powers compared to the Italy of our timeline. First, just because of the general military and economic power we've given to them, but far more importantly, because of these new front lines we've created. If we look at our timeline's Italian Empire, we see that the minor colonies of Eritrea and Somalia don't offer much strategic depth at all. Neither does Libya, which swiftly gets squeezed by the Entente. In our timeline, I truly do not believe that Italian participation would necessarily have been decisive. In this alternate timeline, I believe it very well could be. The Italian and Austrian navies have a far better position in the Mediterranean, leveraging their position in Tunis to start messing with British shipping, forcing the Entente to invest heavily in a campaign in North Africa. Meanwhile, Italy's far stronger position in East Africa, while not necessarily leading to a collapse of Britain, if competently staffed, at least represents a heavy threat, offering Italy immense power to threaten British shipping again. Any British attention given to these fronts takes them away from more important theaters, while the Entente also have millions fewer Italians fighting on their side, while the Balkan front might be totally destroyed, further weakening Entente's hope of breaking open Europe. Even now, there would still be the potential for the Central Powers to lose, but I think it is clear that they are heavily favored to win. From here, the specifics don't really matter too much. Russia in some way collapses, France's position weakens, while Britain feels the pinch of losing access to the Mediterranean, combined with German submarine actions. However it happens, the Central Powers win the war. What might happen next? Well, for the most part, we will just follow a standard Central Powers victory. Germany expanding in the west, gaining some amount of territory from Russia, depending on how hard they win, but what we really care about is what happens to Italy. To start with Africa, we obviously have some form of German Mittelafrika forming, while Italy gains Djibouti and British Somaliland. Other radical gains, like Sudan or Egypt, aren't really likely unless Britain really collapses. But other minor expansions might see Italy solidify their colonial empire. Back in Europe, we have the Balkan, where the partition of Serbia would be slightly different to our timelines. Austria sought to genocide the very concept of a Serbian state, so giving most of the nation to Bulgaria was quite useful. In the same manner, we can expect Italy to annex the Kosovan parts of Serbia, weakening whatever remains even more. Should Greece have supported the Entente in any way, they too might see losses to Bulgaria, Italy and the Ottomans. Over in France, we pretty much know exactly what Italy demands. Corsica, Savoy and Nice, basically satisfying any historical or ethnic claims that Italy has on the nation. Italy might just go a bit further than this, but I don't expect them to really go crazy. I expect something like this to be the peak of Italy in Europe. And this, their peak in Africa. Undeniably, an amazing position for the nation, until you realize what Italy has just done. Whatever form Russia takes, Russia will struggle to rebound. France is permanently crippled, and even Britain is in extreme debt and industrially outpaced by Germany. This is undeniably about the largest we can physically get Italy, but it does come at the cost of handing European hegemony to Germany. Italy from here will never become more than just one of the German allies. Is this territorial expansion worth losing most of their diplomatic flexibility? I will leave that up to you in the comments. But let's go all the way back to the slap of Tunis and have Italy still lose it, sacrificing Italy's biggest colonial objective in favor of a future alliance with France and Britain. In this timeline, on the whole, we don't really need to discuss much in detail, as we can pretty much skip through to World War I. As on paper, Italy was promised nearly everything they could have possibly wanted if they joined the Entente. They were supposed to get South Tyrol, Istria and northern Dalmatia from Austria, as well as a protectorate over Albania and a significant portion of Anatolia, as well as vague promises of colonial expansion. All in all, setting Italy up nicely for after the war. Unfortunately for Italy, this is not quite what happened. Italy's role in World War I was rather underwhelming. They failed to significantly threaten Austria, suffered immense casualties, and at some point were even pushed back towards Venice, leading to fears that Italy might just crumble to the Central Powers, forcing their allies to redirect forces to assist Italy. Now we all know that the Franco-British track record of keeping their promises in World War I was already not good. Combine that with a poor Italian performance and a massive change in the geopolitical situation post-war, and we get the conditions for Italy to be betrayed at the peace table. You see, before the war, Britain was already calculating what might happen after a victory. And in these calculations, they realized that Russia stood to gain a lot, and so did Serbia. Therefore, Britain considered strengthening Italy useful, to potentially counteract Russia in the Balkans. But at the time of the peace talks, Russia had collapsed into Bolshevism and anarchy, and then becoming a great Balkan power wasn't really likely in the short term. This was further worsened by American President Wilson joining the peace talks, as he immediately denounced the gains promised to Italy, leading Italy to fight an uphill diplomatic battle it ultimately lost against the other Entente powers. Now all of this isn't that easily prevented. To truly reach the best negotiating position for Italy, they need to perform much better in the war, Russia needs to not collapse into a civil war, and America needs to not join the war either, or not be as important in the peace talks. Simply put, the Entente needs to win the war about a year earlier to reach the most optimal position for Italy. For the sake of this scenario, how we achieve that isn't all too important. Maybe through their more powerful army and better starting borders, Italy actually achieves more of a breakthrough in the Alps, distracting the Central Powers, perhaps aiding the Russian position. Maybe the Italians have a better influence in the early Balkan Wars, keeping that fight more active. Whatever we do specifically, the Central Powers need to collapse earlier. For the most part then, we get a relatively standard early Entente victory map I have discussed time and time again. But Italy benefits more than in our timeline, annexing more of Tyrol, more of Istria, and actually gaining northern Dalmatia. Italy might have also tried to keep Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Montenegro separate, rather than having them unite into a single state. But outrage within these regions, and from the Russian delegation, would mostly end this idea. Still, to compensate, Italy's position in Albania would be strengthened, specifically in the south. During the fall of the Ottomans, Russia's survival becomes even more crucial. We all know that after World War I, Turkey under Kemal Atatürk fought off the Entente in such a way that he prevented the complete partition of Anatolia. Such a thing would not be possible with Russia in the war, as they care deeply about securing gains against the nation. And the planned partition is thus implemented, including Italy's annexation of the coast and sphere of influence over the west. Over in Africa, Italy is compensated as France and Britain annex the German colonies, either with German Cameroon or more likely with expansions of their East African and Libyan colonies. Italy's position in such a post-war world would be far better. They are one of the big four European powers, and while absolutely the weakest of those four, they still play a huge role in directing European policy, wielding great influence over the states in the region as a counterbalance to Russia, and the potential revival of revanchist nations in the Balkan. Especially if Russia faces significant turmoil, which is likely even after a victory, or Germany, like in our timeline, tries their hand at ultranationalism, Italy, if it wants to, can be a major player in assisting France and Britain to stabilize Europe, their sphere of influence ranging from Vienna and Ankara, and potentially even into Spain, should Italy still intervene in their civil war. From here, Italy can go a number of ways. The future is uncertain, but generally, if they don't mess it up, their position is very solid. Now, to conclude this video, I want to discuss North Africa in both of our timelines today. For the most part, colonialism is just unsustainable, especially as Africa's population starts rapidly outpacing that of Europe. Italian East Africa, for example, will break free at some point. Even if Italy manages to build up a population majority in Eritrea, East Africa will not stop fighting until the Italians are fully evicted. But Italian North Africa is different. Much like how France attempted to make Algeria a core part of France, Italy will try to do the same in Tunis and Libya. But the difference is that Libya has significantly fewer people, as does Tunis. Now, Tunis is debatable and possibly quite difficult, but if Italy wants to, they absolutely could push enough people to Libya to do what France couldn't, and reach a majority in the region, especially amongst the coastline. Should this occur, Libya might just take up a special place amongst all European colonies in Africa, as, while colony after colony falls, Italy simply remains in Libya, Tripoli becoming just as Italian as Naples or Florence. With that though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.